All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. If you don't know me already, my name is Ekkosangen, and let me say that it's incredible seeing so many people here already. But I think you're all tuned in to learn a little bit about avatar creations, so let's get right into it here. So, welcome everyone to Avatars 3. Whoa! If you've ever wondered how an avatar thinks and decides what to do, this is the panel where I'm going to teach you the basics of avatar brains so that hopefully you could take what you learned here and make something really awesome. So, I'm mainly going to be focused on how animator controllers work in Unity, going over each of the playable layers, what states, parameters, and transitions are, and what you can do with them. Then I'm going to show you a little bit of example layers that VRChat gives us, a couple of layers from mine, and then we'll maybe take some questions, and then I'll hop into some of the event worlds, try and answer some questions there. So the obvious first question is just what is Avatars 3.0? And the short answer to that is that it's VRChat's framework for how avatars are built. It was originally released in August of 2020, so it's a little over a year old now. And the largest change was that it moved from using animator override controllers to control your gestures and emotes to giving full access to the animator controller for avatars. It really is just the brains, though, if you're an animator or visual effects artist. Avatars 3.0 is how you'll be triggering your animations on your avatar. And it really was a big leap forward in that regard. There are now so many more ways to make an avatar do something than there was in the past. If you can think of something, you can probably do it. You want to cast a fireball from a wand by shouting, "Fireball!" You can do that. But even better is that VRChat is always evolving and adding even more to what avatars can do. Since the launch of Avatars 3.0, we've gained a few new things, but the big one is that we're now on Unity 2019, which is actually really awesome. The explanation as to why is more technical than I really fully understand myself even, but it's a good thing, and you should update your projects according to the instructions on the VRChat docs. Get ready for me to talk about the docs a lot, by the way. They're very, very useful. But anyway, the big thing for avatars is that they can add and subtract. And okay, maybe those were there from the start, but something newer is that we can even pick random numbers. And if it's not obvious why that's a big deal, just understand that it can be really, really fun in some very interesting ways. More on this a little bit later. Also coming later is Avatar Dynamics, which is prophesized to appear eventually, probably. I imagine I'll have to write a whole lot about Avatar Dynamics when it comes out. But until then, we can only salivate at the opportunities for wacky things our avatars can do when things touch other things. Also, physics bones. Physics bones are really awesome, actually. And let's not forget to pay respects to Avatars 2.0. It got us through to where we are now, but its time has come. VRChat is finally moving on and deprecating Avatars 2.0, which means that eventually we won't be able to upload using SDK2 at all at some point in the future. I don't think they've set a date for it yet, but it's coming eventually. You'll probably get to keep using the older avatars, but no more updates until you convert it to 3.0, which is actually relatively easy, actually. If you're still using SDK2, consider this your fair warning. And also, why? Just why? Just upgrade. Okay, enough talking about the old stuff. Time for the stuff that we came here to see. Let's actually take a quick look at what we'll be talking about here. So, it's a little bit dark, admittedly. That's very dark. But we'll see. That's, night mode on Unity 2019 is actually really good. This is an example of a bit of a complex layer. You can at least see the transitions, but the more you want to do with this, the more complex these layers are generally going to be. But not all layers look like this. Many common avatar features are actually very simple. We'll come back to some more examples once we know what we're looking at, but I hope I've at least shown you so far that it really isn't that scary. Even though it's fine. But before we dive into that, let's start at the very, very, very top. So this is right here is the avatar controller. Right up there. Right up there. Right up there. It's what Unity calls an animator controller, which, as it says on the tin, is what controls the animator component of a model in Unity. It's made up of any number of individual layers, which are each a state machine, and which is just a behavior model that's made up of states and transitions, and it's just kind of like a fancy flowchart. VRChat organizes these animator controllers into what they call playable layers, each of which is designed for a specific purpose. Wait. I think I'm missing a slide here, but I can at least go over what each of them is designed to do. So the base or locomotion layer is intended for animations relating to player movement. So standing, running, jumping, and other movements like that. The additive layer is for additional animations that go on top of the base layer, like breathing or idle standing animations. However, this layer is restricted to humanoid bones only. If you want to animate an idle tail sway or an ear flick, you'll need to put those on the next layer, which is the gesture layer. And the name is a little bit misleading because some gesture animations do go into here, but a lot of them actually don't, as weird as that is. This next layer should only be used for transform animations, so actual like bone movements. And as an example, like a wagging tail, flapping wings as part of a facial expression should be separated into this layer. The action layer is the last of the transform-only layers, and it's used for animations that will take like complete control over your avatar, like emotes. So like the clapping emotes, the die emotes. If it's taking control of your avatar, it should go in the action layer. There's some special things you do need to do when working with this layer. But if you want to add custom emotes, looking at the example action layer is a great way to learn about how you should do it. And finally, the effects layer is for anything and everything that doesn't go on one of the other layers. So animating blend shapes, material changes, shader stuff, enabling or disabling objects, all of that goes on the effects layer. And this is likely the playable layer that you'll work with the most. So don't be surprised if your avatar ends up with only a custom FX layer, because oftentimes you don't even need to touch any of the other ones. There are a few special layers, namely the T-pose, the IK pose, and the sitting pose layers, but I'm not going to talk about them too much because they're very special case and you generally don't need a custom one. VR chats are sufficient for 99.9999, etc. avatars. Instead, I'm just going to start straight into talking about the actual pieces of the animator controller. So we're going to start off with states. So here we have our controller. Hopefully you can see it a little better than I can. Again, it's a little dark. I apologize. Unity dark mode is. It looks a little bit better in paper. Don't worry. But here we have our controller with one layer. And you can see that we have just a couple of states in it here. The orange one at the top, and there's a gray one just below it. You can also see we have a green, a red, and cyan one. They're not technically states, but they're still important to us because they sort of act like states. And all a state really is just a container for an animation, or rather, a representation of an animation. They don't always have to contain an animation, but they often do. And states can control a few things about an animation, such as the speed and offset. They also have some special behaviors added by VRChat that I'll get into a little bit later. As for the special ones, the green one is the entry, which Unity highlights in orange. Or sorry, it connects to the default state, which is the state highlighted in orange, instead of it being gray like the rest of the states on the layer. The red one is the exit, which tells the controller to start at the entry again. And last but not least is the cyan one, which is called the any state, because it acts like every other state on the layer. You want to be very careful when using this. It's very, very powerful. It can save you a lot of effort, but that also means it can very easily cause problems when you're working with it. Lastly, states can also contain blend trees. It's a little bit more advanced, but basically they're a group of animations blended together and controlled by one or more parameters. You'll most often see these being used to control a puppet, like a tail control, but there are many uses for these, especially in locomotion animations. So here's what there's that slide, haha, but we don't need that anymore, as it was just the playable layers one. But here's the inspector for it. We've got the inspector for a regular state here with a few important settings that you might not actually even touch. The motion is the animation that will play, so that's important to know. It starts playing it when it enters the state, and the speed just below it is how fast the animation will play. The material can take in a float parameter and multiply it by the speed to dynamically change how fast the animation plays. The motion time allows you to directly and dynamically control the animation itself with the value of a float parameter. And this actually sounds pretty cool, but the usefulness might be a little bit limited in reality. It's up to you to find a use case for this. The mirror just lets you reverse the playback of the motion. It's pretty simple. Cycle offset lets you set an offset to start a looping animation at. Foot IK, you probably shouldn't touch. Just don't touch it. It's a little bit weird. But then there's right defaults, which is even more weird. I'm going to skip it for now. There's a technical explanation about what it does. You probably don't want to touch it. If you don't know if it should be on or off, you should probably leave it on. And at the bottom, there's just a list of transitions, which is what we're going to talk about right now, because now that we have states, we need a way to get from one state to another. And the way we achieve that is through transitions. And I don't seem to have the next slide here. Oh, wait, no, there we go. We're good to go. We're adding transitions. When you're making a layer, a general rule of thumb is that each state needs a transition to it and a transition away from it. If there isn't a transition away from it, then it becomes a dead end, which if you end up there, your layer can't ever do anything else, which is kind of bad, actually. So here's what you get. There we go. I gotta get closer. Haha. This is what you get on a transition. Just in case you can't see it, we have tongue-tied today, because here's where the transitions inspector is. you can see there's a few things that control how the transition works and a conditions area right at the bottom. The settings are pretty self-explanatory. How long a transition lasts, the offset for the destination, and if it can be interrupted by other transitions. And that last one is actually really, really interesting. Feel free to ask me a little bit about that, but the basic gist is that you can have a transition interrupt another transition either where it is or where it's going, which is pretty useful, actually. I would recommend looking into that a little bit more. But as far as the conditions there at the bottom, what kind of conditions can we have? And that would be any condition that looks at a parameter. Every transition must have at least one condition, but there's one condition that isn't obvious, and that's actually the exit time right at the very top. If you set your transition to have an exit time, it acts as a condition that says that the state needs to play through a certain percentage of its animation before it can transition away. But what are parameters? Which is, if you're programming minded, transitions are just slide. Oh no. There we go. Aha. Parameters are a variable value identified by a name and a type. And we've got 3 types of parameters that we can use in VRChat. The int, or integer, is a whole number, so 1, 2, 3, and so on. The float, which is a decimal number like 3.14. And the bool, or boolean, which is either true or false. Every avatar gets a total of 128 bits of custom parameter space, with integers and floats taking up 8 bits each, and booleans taking just 1. By themselves, they actually don't do anything, but VRChat provides some very useful parameters that give information about how your avatar is moving, talking, and gesturing. And you get to use any or all of them if you want, without taking up any of your own parameter space. There's actually so many of these that I don't really have to describe them all, but a couple of really good ones that you'll want to start with is probably gesture left and right, which tells your avatar which gesture you're doing on each hand, as well as probably AFK. If you're looking to make an AFK animation, it just tells your avatar if you're AFK or not. If you have your headset off, or you press, I think it's end on desktop. It's one of those buttons over there. It will set you to AFK. It'll play. You can have it play an animation. It's really cool. But I would recommend that you check out VRChat's docs to make sure that you have all the information about all of those, because they're all pretty much useful in some capacity. But hold on. If our custom parameters don't do anything by themselves, how do we do anything? And that's where our expressions menu comes in. That menu, the menu that pops up when you press R on desktop or you hold the quick menu button in VR, one of those sections is the expressions section. And all it really is just changing parameters to various values based on what you tell each of the buttons to do. By default, it just shows the default VRChat emotes. If you have an Avatar's 2.0 avatar, it will probably show any custom emotes in there as well. But we can put our own custom menu in with whatever buttons we want. And we have a variety of different buttons to pick from. The most basic ones are the toggle, which stays on until it's pressed again, and the button, which only stays on until you stop pressing it. These are the most common types of controls in your expression menu, and luckily they're the most straightforward to use. You plug in your parameter, what value you want it on, and you're done. The other 3 are the puppets: the radial, the 2-axis, and the 4-axis puppets. Radial puppets are the circular slider control. Manipulates just a single float parameter from 0 to 1. And then the 2-axis and 4-axis puppets are very similar looking controls. That's the third one over there. And the main difference is that a 2-axis puppet controls 2 float parameters from -1 to 1, while the 4-axis puppet controls 4 float parameters from 0 to 1. Honestly, I don't think I've ever found a use for a 4-axis puppet, but radial and 2-axis puppets are very useful for slider controls and puppeteering tails and ears manually. Here's what the VRC expressions menu looks like in the inspector. It's all very straightforward, actually. You can give each control a name that will act as its label. You pick which kind of control you want. You can even select a custom graphic that you can use as an icon and which parameter it will modify. So if you want a button to toggle a hat, you would add a control, set it as a toggle, set the parameter to a Boolean you put in your VRC expression parameters file, and you name it something like toggle hat. Once everything is hooked up in the animator controller as well, theoretically it should work. If not, well, we have our avatar help channel in the Furality Discord. Super helpful people there. Another useful thing about menus is that you can have submenus. You can also have submenus in your submenus. You can also have submenus in your submenus in your submenus, and you get the point. I don't believe VRChat puts a limit on how deep your submenus can go, so feel free to play around with that. If you find a limit, please tell me. I would be very curious to know what it is. But you can use it to organize your controls in whatever way suits you. You can even have submenus set parameters to a value while you're inside them. Kind of interesting. So we've got our states, we've got our transitions, we've got our parameters, and we know how to control them. Now I want to show you how it all comes together. So here we have just a very simple state, a very small, simple layer, rather. One that would be similar to one that you make when you're hooking up a toggle. The default state up here is the orange, the default state, is the top one up there. That will be your animation to, say, turn your hat off. And the state below that will animate turning the hat on. The transitions will look at your hat parameter to see if it's true or false. And that will be what gets controlled by the menu. When you toggle the hat on in the menu, it makes the hat parameter true, which activates the transition to go from the off state to the on state. And when you toggle the hat off, the hat parameter becomes false. The transition goes from the on state back to the off state. Once you understand it, you can put these layers together actually pretty quickly. This one might not show up quite as easily, actually. I'm missing another one. Oh wait, no, there it is, right there. Haha. I'm just silly. But here's a little bit of a slightly more complex layer. This one's actually the layer that controls my AFK state. And you can see it follows a couple of different paths around. You have a good number of transitions here. In this case, one for when I have my clothing enabled and one for when it's disabled. You can also see that the first few transitions away from the default state have a couple of arrows to them, which means that there are multiple transitions from and to the same two states. If you're into programming, you can think of this as like an OR statement. So one of these transitions would read kind of like if I manually enable my AFK animation and my clothing is disabled, or if I manually, or if VRChat says I'm AFK and my clothing is disabled, then transition to this AFK state. Once I return from AFK and disable my manual AFK, it does an exit animation in the other state that's there. And then once that's finished, it's just using the exit time condition, transitions back up into the default state, which is just me saying I'm not AFK. As you can see, the layers can be as simple or as complex as you need them. You have lots of different animations for various circumstances. You'll have states and transitions going every which way, but it's all about just using those three basic parts: the states, transitions, and the parameters. An important thing to note about each layer, though, is that they can only be in one place at a time. You can't be in multiple states at once. You would have to make a new layer, which can be in its own state. But just to throw you a few of the more complex you can do, some of the more complex things you can do with states. Let's talk a little bit about state behaviors. Here's all 6 of them, but I'm going to talk about. So don't be surprised if you don't use all of these or even any of these. They're very niche, they're very useful, but the use cases can be a little bit limited to do something very complex with. For completeness sake, I'm going to cover each of them just a little bit here. So let's start with we'll start with the playable layer control and the animator layer control, because they do about the same thing, just on a different scale. What they're doing is you can change the weight of a layer. For the playable layer control, you're controlling an entire playable layer. This is something that the action layer does pretty often, actually. And the animator layer control controls just a single layer on a single playable layer. And that's so. If you want to look and see how you use like the playable layer control, look in the example action layer. It uses it pretty heavily in there. But everything is. You probably won't need to use it, honestly. It's if you don't know what weight is, just know that 1 is on, 0 is off, and everything between that is a scary no man's land of weirdness. I've tried to use it. It's gotta do a lot of learning for that one. But next, let's talk about the locomotion control. It's very simple. Just allows you to disable your movement until you enable it again. You can still move around in your play space, so like if you were to walk around in your space, you're still going to move. But the actual like controller movement is disabled. Might be useful. I've never used it. Might be useful for this, actually, for staying up on a stage, but I've never used it. Next, we have probably one of the most useful ones, which is the animator tracking control. It's the much larger one down in the bottom left. It is actually a way that you can control whether an animation can take full control over parts of your body, and disable like any tracking that's being done. The best example I can give for that is that you can actually disable the automatic blinking and eye movements that VRChat uses. So if you have an expression that closes your eyes, you really don't want to have your avatar blink at that point, because then it overdrives your eyelids and it looks kind of weird for a moment. Giving the animation control of your eyes and eyelids means that VRChat won't automatically have your avatar blink. Just don't forget to restore the tracking when you leave the state. The next one I'll talk about is the avatar parameter driver. This is the mathy one that I talked about originally. Really cool because it can have it add or subtract a value to a parameter. Or you can have it choose a random value between 2 limits to have that parameter change to. Like I said before, avatars that can do math are actually really cool. First person to make a calculator avatar is going to get is going to be super cool. Don't underestimate the power of math on avatars. And last, still very interesting state behavior is the animator temporary pose space. It's a bit of an ambiguous name, but the gist is that enabling it moves your viewpoint. So like where you're looking out of your headset or like on desktop, you're looking at the one eye. And it moves that viewpoint to where your head is located. And that's the theory behind it. I haven't used it a whole lot. People aren't talking about it too much. I should play with it a little bit just to see what I can get it to do, but just promise me not to use it on avatars to try and induce motion sickness. That'd be a little bit mean. But I think that's all of them. And I think I've given you, at this point, I think I've given you a pretty nice baseline for what Avatars 3.0 is all about. And before I leave you, I do have one big tip and one big warning. The big tip is that when you make a new layer, set your layer weight to 1. Like I said before, 0 is off. It starts at 0. Anything in between 0 and 1 is spooky. Just set it to 1. Just set it to 1. You'll forget. I guarantee you. You'll forget. I have forgotten more times than I care to admit. But if an animation isn't working, probably forgot to set your layer weight to 1. Usually. Yeah, that guy knows what I'm talking about. But the big warning that I have is about right defaults. VRChat's documentation mentions it briefly to say that they don't want us to use it. It's not a decision that I think is incorrect necessarily, but it's very important to know exactly what right defaults is and what not using it means you need to do with your animations. The topic is a little bit too long for this presentation, so I'm just going to say that if you want to just set up some facial expressions on your avatar, you just want to manipulate some blend shapes, just use it. It's probably not going to break anything. It's much easier to do expressions with blend shapes if right defaults is on. So just use it. It's got to learn to walk before you can run. Just remember, if you use VRChat's example gesture layer, like most older tutorials would suggest you do, just remember that they start with right defaults off, so you have to turn them on. Actually, one more warning that I've technically already said, but it's worth repeating. Using the any state in your layers is dangerous. Be 1000% sure about what you're doing with it. It's very useful, but very, very dangerous. But that's pretty much just going to wrap things up. Thank you all once again for your time, and I hope everyone goes out there and builds something really cool. If you do something you think is awesome and you learn something clever you can do with it, or even if you want to just know if something's possible, just let me know. You got my socials up there. I love to see what people have made and hear about crazy ideas that might just work. And it looks like I have a little bit of time here to take a few questions if you have any. So if you make a nice little orderly line just up in the front there, I can take a few questions, I think. Yeah, Jazz Funker, come on up. Hello. Yeah.
State, like, did you have some personal experience
when using the any state? So I had somebody who made a toggle using the any state instead of just like transitioning to each state individually. They use the any state to transition to both states. Technically that would work, But what they didn't know is that if that transitions gain a setting that when they're coming from the any state that toggles whether they can transition to themselves. And that made things a little bit weird because the thing they were trying to toggle would just blink on and off over and over and over really, really fast. So they were a little bit confused about it until I saw their layer and I was like, oh, yeah, you probably shouldn't do it this way. It's much easier to just go up and down, back and forth kind of thing. But theoretically, it's exactly the same thing. Just be very careful. Yes. Anybody else have any questions? Maybe if you could read me one from a chat somewhere. But if not, yeah, sounds good. Looks like we don't have any more questions here. So again, thank you all for coming.